Hi, Bob from Pinegrow here with the third video in our series looking at using CSS Grid in Pinegrow. In the first video, we introduced CSS Grid, and in the second video, we put together an entire page in Pinegrow. In this video, we will look at how to make that page responsive. Let's get started. So our page looks good on the large screen where we put it together, but how does it look on smaller screens? So we can just open another screen. We can see that on small screens, we have some text that pushes off to the side and creates another column. If we look on medium screens, it doesn't look too bad, but this is a little bit squished here. And again, our nav menu has disappeared, so we're going to have to deal with that. And finally, let's see how it looks if we go to an even bigger screen. So if we go to a really big screen, that actually doesn't look too bad. How about we go a little bigger? Something like a high-resolution retina screen. That begins to look a little bit stretched and just doesn't really make a lot of sense. So basically, we're going to have to go ahead and put in two different breakpoints. One for when the screen gets smaller, and one for where the screen gets larger than the large screen size. Since Bootstrap has a built-in breakpoint at 992 pics, we'll use that for degrading down to a smaller screen. For the larger screen, Bootstrap has a breakpoint at 1200 pics, but this might be a little bit small for our purposes. Never fear, adding breakpoints in Pinegrow is easy, and we'll create a new rule to target screen sizes at 1600 pics and up. So I can hear some of you out there saying, wait, why didn't you design mobile first? One real strength of CSS Grid is being able to easily divide up large areas of the screen. You could argue that it isn't particularly good for smaller screens where we typically want just a single column. So when styling with CSS Grid, it is often best to design for a medium or large size screen and then degrade down for smaller screens. Let's close this down and we'll just work for right now with our large screen. So the first thing that we need to do to begin to make this page responsive is to move all of our inline styling over to the rules, because media queries, of course, don't work with inline styling. We probably should have used classes in the first place, but in the interest of time, I did everything inline, but that means now we have to move them over. Luckily, we didn't have to use a lot of CSS to get this page layout, and converting from inline styles to rules is pretty easy in Pinegrow. And in fact, you can see there's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different orange paint brushes where there's inline styling that needs to be converted. So let's get started. We're going to start by selecting the body. We'll go over to our style page, and we can see that here's the inline styling that's currently on our topmost body element. So what we can then do to convert this over to a rule is just click this plus sign in the upper right side. That will bring up our normal CSS rule dialog box with the breadcrumbs. And so we're just going to select the body selector and then click on create. That has now moved that inline styling out into our style sheet. And we can see that the orange paintbrush is gone. So let's just go ahead and move down the DOM tree and add the rest in. So if we click here and we go to our style sheet again, we have this rule, click on the plus. In this case, since we already have a class of navbar, we can just go ahead and click on that and click create. Okay, so that's moved over. In this case, we're going to add a new class to this since the P is pretty generic, and we'll also target the text that's down below. Okay, so now we've moved all of our inline styles over to our style sheet, and so we can begin to add on our media queries. The majority of our CSS changes will be to the grid layout that is applied to the body element. So let's start by selecting the body in the tree panel and then opening the styles panel. We will duplicate the rule set that applies to the body element. Since we are going to add a total of 3 layouts, depending on size, we will make 2 additional copies of the body rule set by right-clicking on the rule set and then selecting Duplicate. We can now see 3 copies of the rule set, 1, 2, 3, with the bottom 2 crossed out. This is because the rule set on top was created last, and if rules have the same specificity, the browsers will apply the one that loads in last. Always keep this in mind. So each of those rule sets are for a different size. First, we need to add that new breakpoint. To do this, go to the page menu and select Manage Breakpoints. Now we're going to add a breakpoint. And as I said before, we'll go with 1600 pixels. Now we can close that. Okay, so each of these rule sets that we duplicated are for a different screen size. And we're going to designate the last duplicate that we made, the one that's actually at the top here, as the one for the large page size. So why is it at the top? So remember, your cascading rules are going to load in, and the ones that load in the last, if they have the same specificity, are going to be the ones that are active. So this one that's active at the top of the list is actually the one that came in last. So we'll highlight that, go down to Media Query, and click on the 1600 pixels and up Media Query. We can see that that now disappeared from the page, or from our list of rules. We just have a new active one plus our inactive body rule, since they both have the same specificity. And because we're on a 1024 pixel page, that rule set doesn't show up. So if we increase this to, say, 2000 pixels, and then we go out to the DOM tree and just do a refresh by going to the nav bar and back to the body and then back to the style sheet, we can now see that our media query is showing up as the active rule set. And since it's the last rule set on our style sheet, it preempts the other 2 rule sets that would be applied. Okay, so now we can do the same thing. We'll go back to our large page, and we actually want now the newly activated rule. This is going to be the next one down from the top, so our second duplicate. We want this one to be active from 992 pixels and up. So it's actually going to be active on this page. We can see it right here. And that last one that loaded in that we're going to use for our smallest screen size is inactive. Okay, so now that we have our media queries set up, let's go ahead and start styling. First, we're going to change the page for small devices. So we're going to open another page in the page view and have it set for small. So it's kind of good to have both of these open at the same time, because then you can see if any changes that you're making to this small one have an impact on this larger page. So right now, since we switched pages, we need to reselect that body. And let's see what's going on. So again, as I pointed out, we have this kind of pushing off the side of the page. This also looks all squished because there's these extra columns in here that maybe we can get rid of. And the logo is kind of pushed over into the corner here by the decoration. One quick thing that I wanted to point out that when you're working with multiple screens, you have to keep in mind is that The styles that are going to show up as active are going to be determined by which of these paint brushes is actually highlighted. So make sure you have the correct one highlighted when you go to edit some styles. So in this case, we're doing the small screen, so the small screen paintbrush should be highlighted. So now we just have one body rule, the body rule that doesn't have any media query. That's going to be for the small screen. Usually in smaller devices, we're only going to want a single column of content. In this case, we're going to leave the two outermost columns still there to provide a little bit of white space at the edge of the page. And then we're going to have a large main column in the center containing our title, author, and text areas, and delete the other two columns, leaving us with just 3 columns. So let's go ahead and open up the grid. Let's pull this up here. And so now one other thing that I should point out is that the Pinegrow grid editor is fairly smart. It realizes which view you're editing or want to edit. But sometimes if multiple different grids are going to potentially apply, when you click on this, you'll see that the CSS rule here changes, and we can have the option of either editing the non-media query rule or the media query rule. So let's go back over to here, and let's make those changes. So again, I'm going to leave this main column here with our title, author, and text intact. I'm going to leave this one and this one intact. So I'm going to get rid of this column, and this column. Okay, so the first thing that you can see is that things look a little bit odd. That's because we eliminated one of our content areas, and so what happens now is that quote has been pushed off to the side into a brand new column. So we need to bring that back. So what we're going to do is create another row below our main text, and then we're going to go ahead and give that area a name of quote. And now that moves that quote back down underneath our text where we kind of want it, and eliminates a lot of the overlap off to that side. We can still see that there's a gap over here that is giving us a problem, and we'll go into that in a second. So in this case, we're going to remove that gap. Now that springs over to there. Don't need quite as much space to the left and right. So let's go ahead and decrease those down. Let's reduce the size to 5%, both sides. So getting slightly better. Logo is still crunched up here. Okay, so let's see if we can fix that. Let's first start by expanding the amount of size that the logo has. So I'm just going to double click here, select the logo. That's going to bring it out nicely to the full size that we'd kind of want it. Next thing that I can see is that this decorator really just kind of crowds the page, pushes up into here, maybe isn't needed on small screens. So in this case, actually, we're going to want to hide it on the small screen and then re-show it when we go to a larger screen. So let's go ahead and select that element. And what we're going to do is actually duplicate this rule like we did the other time with the body. And then what we want to do is on the, for this one, we want to add a media query and say if we're above 992, then apply these rules. And on the small screen, we're just going to go ahead and delete this, this, and this, and actually add a rule to say display none. So now that's hidden on small screens. And then what we have to do is we now have to go over here to the 992 screen. Then we just have to make sure that we're on the media query rule and not the regular rule. And then we can go down and select display block. And that'll bring it back up on our larger screens, but it still remains hidden here on the mobile screen. Okay, so one of the last things we have to do is we have to fix our nav bar. So let's, on the mobile view, so let's go back over. I think one of the things that happened was that when I removed the one class to get rid of the different color of the nav bar, I think it made it so that the SVG that gets loaded in as our toggler no longer comes in as black. So we're going to go ahead and add that back on. So we'll select the nav bar, make sure we're selected for our mobile screen, go back to our properties, add class, and then we're going to add a class of navbar light. Okay, so that makes our navigation pop back up on mobile. The only other thing that I think I want to do is I think I want to expand out the size of this to take up just a titch bit more. So let's take it to like 15% maybe. So that now puts our nav fully in that container. It also gives us a little bit of margin to this side of the page, which feels a little bit better to me. I don't know if we want to bring this in or not, maybe by just a little bit. Yeah, that looks pretty good. All right, so I think overall we're done with the mobile styling. There's some other things that we could fool with, like for example, the drop-down menus might no longer be a good color, or we might have to add a background to have them stand out against the image. But let's switch now to the styling on the larger size page, so the above 1600 breakpoint. Let's just get our page view rearranged. So we're going to close this down. I guess we'll keep the still keep the large size. We'll close down the extra small, and we're going to open another one that we're going to make really large, 2000 pixels. So I guess the biggest thing right now that I can see is that the overall screen width is pretty large. It doesn't really have to be stretched that far out based on the content. So one solution is to simply limit the max screen size with CSS, not really change the grid up at all. Make sure that the paintbrush is highlighted. Then we can go over to our styles. Make sure, actually first, that our body is selected. Go to our styles. Make sure that the body rule for the large size is selected. And then go ahead and add another rule to that, where we're saying that our maximum screen width is, I guess, the same as our breakpoint, 1600 pixels. So basically, as the screen increases in size, once it hits 1600 pixels, our content will remain fixed. So that isn't too bad. I mean, maybe we could tweak the room here and here, but I think we could really call it good. The only other thing that I would do before having this go into production is basically, there's no reason to duplicate the rest of these various rules in our 1600 that are present in our 992 pick. So we can go ahead and, for example, delete this, 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 and this. So now the only thing that we're changing, we're leaving all the same rules that were at 992 picks and up. The only thing we're changing is that max width that comes into play when we hit 1600 pixels. So CSS Grid is now fairly well supported. More than 96% of modern desktop and mobile browsers are able to use CSS Grid. Internet Explorer, which paradoxically gave birth to one of the original Grid prototypes, still needs prefixing with -ms-. That's for Internet Explorers 10 and 11. Edge does not need prefixing. We can also write CSS rules that will be added in browsers without grid support. And those types of rules are called @supports rules. Now, these rules, we can't add them directly in Pinegrow by clicking. We need to actually type them out. They're much like media queries and surround rule sets so that changes are only instituted if CSS Grid is not supported. So let's just go ahead and reopen. We'll just go ahead and close this one down, reopen our CSS sheet. So we're in this one. Can go down to the bottom. So the way that these work is we have an @support, and then we say what we do or don't want supported. So let me just copy and paste this in. One way we could do it is to wrap all of our current rules in an @supports display grid that will say if the browser does support display grid, then all these rules will be used. The other way to do it is to do the negation. And for that, we just type not. So @supports not display grid. And anything that would be in here in this body rule would be displayed on any of those browsers that don't support display grid. Pinegrow gives us another feature so that we can be able to write these rules a little bit easier. If we look under the drop down for the screen size, we can see that down here there's a check next to CSS Grid. That means that we want Pinegrow to support CSS Grid. If we turn this off, we see that we get this big degradation down and we lose a whole bunch of things. So really in here, the main things we'd want to do are probably go ahead and center this up, eliminate this, and change the color on the title and the author. And all of those could be put within this @supports not display grid rule set. So I hope that this tutorial has been informative. I hope it also has shown you how much fun it can be to design visibly with Pinegrow and CSS Grid, being able to drag things around, being able to quickly change how your page looks, how your page is laid out, just by doing things like dragging these tabs. And I hope you can also appreciate how little CSS is required with CSS Grid to be able to put together a fairly responsive, nice looking page quickly. So that's it. And as always, feel free to reach out with comments or questions in the forum or by email. And in the meantime, have fun designing with Pinegrow.